Thank you, Fidelma, for a really brilliant, shocking, but not surprising talk, because this is the history of mining going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. This is Mount Everest, and Mount Everest has a mass of about 175 billion tons of rocks and material. And in 1970, globally, we were mining somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 billion tons of rock and material on a yearly basis, so in the year 1970. And by 2020, that had risen just in 50 years to 100 billion tons a year. And to get us to our green, so-called green transition point, our green tech nirvana, by about 2040, we will be mining a Mount Everest every single year. So every single year from 1940 onwards, it'll be growing by another 100 years. It'll be 2 or 3 Mount Everest a year with 3% growth rate happening. But by about 2040, we will be digging and blasting and ripping out of the earth a Mount Everest every single year. And that's not sustainable. The atmosphere, the environment cannot sustain that degree of aggressive activity. 90% of this is waste. In many situations, it can be up to 98, 99%. So most of the long-term impact of mining is in the waste that it actually creates. These tailing dams, which there's something like 4,000 or 5,000 around the world, massive dams full of waste, which I'll come to later. Something like 3 to 5 tailing dams collapse every year with devastating consequences on the environment. Many of these tailing dams are directly leaking into the water table and doing all sorts of other damage over time, because they're not designed to last. They're designed to last as long as the mining company is there to take out what it needs to take out and then disappear and set up again in the Cayman Islands or wherever it will. So mining growth pretty much maps GDP growth. So growth, over the last 30, 40 years, on average, somewhere in the region of 3% a year. That maps almost identically with material extraction and consumption. So GDP is the blue line and mineral extraction is the red line. So it makes sense to build these cars and planes and SUVs. We need materials, and we're building a lot more of them. So GDP is mapping very strongly with mineral and material growth. So the weight of the planet, and that has been estimated by scientists, is somewhere in the region of 6 ronograms, which is an absolutely incredible weight. And the crust of the planet, which is about 0.5% of the overall mass of the planet, is about 30 quintillion tons of actual material. So I did some calculations, and I said that just following a 3% growth rate, what would happen if we keep growing? Because this is an exponential model, 3% every year. So what would happen? Well, you don't, by 2020, looking back 100 years, we would have mined in total about 20 Mount Everest. And the line stays quite low for a couple of 100 years or so. Then by 2400, it really begins to explode. And by 2559, we have mined the entire crust of the earth. So of course, that can't happen. We're going to hit a crisis point much earlier than that. But basically, as somebody said to me, a geologist said to me, humans, we've been here 5 minutes and we'll be gone in 5 minutes. 500 years in the history of the earth, even in the history of civilization and human beings, is not a long time. Within 200 or 300 years, we're going to hit absolute crisis points and probably much earlier with our basically growth death cult. Growth is a recipe for destruction. We can't keep growing. Even at 1% growth, we will hit extremely serious limits within about 100 years or so. So basically, what you see in a lot of these exponential environments is that it doesn't seem like a lot for a period, and then all of a sudden, it really becomes explosive. So by the time it becomes explosive, it's too late. There's nothing we can essentially do. By 20, we have mined 32% of the crust of the earth, and then in another 30 years, 100%, because that's what exponential growth is like. It explodes all of a sudden. It doesn't look like it's a lot. You can hide it, and then suddenly it comes in a devastating wave. And CO2 is a good example of this. Of the modern human species, which is around about 200,000 years, if we were to measure, say, 100% of the impact of CO2, of the CO2 that we have caused since we emerged as a modern human species 200,000 years ago, 25% of that would have been caused from 200,000 BC up until 1975. So of all the CO2 humans are responsible for, we caused 25% of it between 200,000 BC and 1975. We caused another 25% in just basically 20 years, and another 50% between 1995 and 2020. So all the really serious CO2 damage that we have caused 75% of that since 1970. And that, of course, directly maps the incredible growth of mining from 25 billion tons in 1970 to 100 billion tons. Mining is an extraordinarily destructive industry. There is nothing possibly green. There is nothing possibly sustainable about mining. All mining is dirty and devastating. And of course, we see these exponential growth. Rate of global warming growth has tripled in the last 20 years. So in 1970, essentially, we reached certain tipping points, and it's only beginning to explode upwards. And if we don't radically change our culture and our culture of waste and our culture of consumption, we are going to hit extraordinary barriers within the next 20, 40, or 50 years in the process. The way mining has changed as well. This is one of the latest mining vehicles. You go back 30 years or so, a typical one of these trucks would be carrying maybe 20 or 40 tons of material. This truck can carry 400 tons of material. It's 350 tons empty. It can carry about 400 tons. So what's happening in mining is becoming much more short-term and much more intense. 100 or 120 years ago, mining, it may have been destructive, but it had to invest in the community, at least to some degree, in the Welsh mines, etc., invest in schools, because it aimed to be around for 100 years or more. Mining today, they aim to be around for about 10 or 20 years. So when they're coming into Ireland, they're coming in for a quick smash and grab to devastate the area and then leave with their profits in the process. Tailings, I said earlier, is the after effects, which are far more damaging than the actual mining, because the tailings will remain toxic for about 1,000 years in the process. And the tailings are basically left to the public and left to the government. The mining companies will not care for the tailings for more than 20 or 40 years, or maybe 50 years at maximum. Greenhouse gas emissions from mining results in about 3 trillion damages every year, and most of this affected with the actual tailings and dumping process. So if you look, I was talking to a geologist there a couple of days ago, a mining geologist who's been involved in mining for about 40 years. And he said, you could say the impact of a mine, the total life cycle of a mine is about 1,000 years. And there might be 20 years or so for the discovery, and there might be 20 years for the mining. But 960 years is for the waste. and dealing with that waste. And the mining companies never have and never will deal with that waste. That is the legacy they will leave our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. They will devastate the area, those rivers and those mussels and salmon are spawning for 1,000 years. The area will be devastated. The water table will be devastated. That will be the legacy. They'll get a quick profit kill out of it for 20 years, and then the legacy will be left for everyone to pick up that actual legacy. So what mining companies do, which is pretty excellent from their point of view, is they privatize the profits and they socialize the waste. They leave the waste after them. The impact of mining around the world, when you look at somebody did a study of a smartphone and the cost of the materials. So looked at the iPhone 6, which back in around, I think, 2008, 2009 was retailing at about $700. And they calculated how much the raw materials were for the 70 or so. There's in a smartphone, there's up to 70 different materials in a particular smartphone. And they calculated that all those materials cost $1. So this is why we can never clear up the waste, because there's actually very little money in mining unless you do it at a large scale in the process, unless you're one of these big multinational companies. And the vast majority of the money, we don't respect our materials. We don't treat them as a true or a genuine value thing in the process. So $1 out of the 700 price went to the mining. And I suppose $200 went to the Apple brand or whatever you actually call it. So 0.1%. And what actually went to the workers, 90 cents of that dollar will go to the actual mining companies and maybe 10 cents to the workers. So they'll pay off some senior executives and some good jobs, but most of the mining jobs, whether it's in the Amazon or in Ghana or in Guinea, are extremely poor level. And what they do is they devastate in Ghana or Guinea or the Amazon, they devastate the local fishing industry. They make it impossible for agriculture to exist because they destroy the quality of the soil in the process. So their overall impact, they destroy the roads and the red dusts and the dusts that occur in the health of the animals. We know about that in Auchinish alumna and the devastation to animals and the health of people. Aluminium mining. Everything is increasing. Everything is exploding. 559% increase in mining since 1970. And to get to our so-called green transition, we will need 4 times the materials that we need to make combustion vehicles, to actually build these electric vehicles. So we look at the growth in cobalt needed for the green, so-called green tech, and lithium explosion in growth figures between now and 2035. So a lot of this technology is the dirtiest industry on earth. The greatest concentration of toxic dumps are in California, and they are toxic dumps for building the computer industry in the 40s and the 50s. But the computer industry has been very clever from a marketing point of view by advertising things like the cloud. Well, the cloud is on the ground, and the cloud is 70 million servers, and each one of these servers takes 1 to 2 tons of CO2 during its manufacturing process, and probably 4 to 6 tons of material for every one of these servers needs to be actual mined. So 1 to 2 tons of CO2 to make them, and 20 million of them are destroyed every year. Many of them are physically crushed for so-called security reasons. The computer industry has one of the worst records of any industry for the maintenance and repair ability and making their devices have a decent and a long life. A typical computer should last 20 years to be anywhere remotely sustainable, and most of these servers are lasting 2, 3, 4 years absolutely maximum. So this is our so-called green tech world. It's one of the dirtiest industries on earth, but it's got really good marketing. That's what saves it every single time. So another issue is the type of waste that's occurring, which is highly influenced by mining activity, but also by the high-tech industries. Back in 1900, most of the waste or most of the materials were organic of a type. By 2005, that had dropped to about 32%. So of the stuff that we are making and manufacturing, only 32% of the materials that was going into that were truly circular, truly reusable and sustainable. And by 2050, it's estimated that it'll be at 20%, and the other 80% will be plastics and all sorts of other, poisoned materials. We're only recycling about 17-18% of electronics every year. Electronics waste is absolutely exploding, about 50 million tons every year now, enough to build a Great Wall of China. In another 15 years, it'll be 100 million tons. We're only recycling 17%, and of the 17% that we're recycling, we're only getting back materials. We're only recovering about 30% of materials from that 17%, which means that only 5% of electronic materials can be reused. The rest of it ends up, unfortunately, in poor countries like Ghana or Nigeria or Pakistan or India. A lot of it used to go to China. We dump these electronics. They're often sent on what are called ships of doom sent to these poor countries where they are quote unquote recycled. This is the recycling that occurs in one particular dump where they burn cables. You can imagine the noxic smoke that is coming off those cables to actually get to the copper in the actual cables. So 18 million children are involved in this, and of course in inhalation of these sorts of toxic fumes are extraordinarily dangerous for young children, and 13 million women around the world doing this. So the world that we are creating, the type of world that we are building, the so-called green world, is one of the most dangerous and toxic worlds we could possibly create. What is the solution? Well, the solution is to radically slow down. The solution is something like degrowth. The solution is genuine recycling, designing materials in a much more simple way. Most electronics, most of our modern things that we build are not designed to be recycled deliberately because of planned obsolescence. So we need a radical degrowth movement and a culture where we look after materials much less and where we massively reduce the quantity of mining that occurs. Thank you for listening.